just spotlight my view for everyone. Okay, so this is obviously my piece of paper. Now here's my inspiration, the picture that we're working from. The things that I see about it really clearly is I've got this very strong horizon line across here, which really sort of locates my image as being a landscape. Then I've got much more sky than I've got sea. I've got about a third of sea and 2/3 of sky. So my horizon line's got to take that into consideration. We've got to get that at the lower half of our image. So most of our image information, the busy bits as it were, are going to be down below. This area here where it's light, I'm almost sort of going to not paint that. I want to kind of keep that. This here is going to be the paper coming through. So any sky detail is going to be washes of colour sort of towards this way. Then I'm going to almost leave this out and then do this almost completely in pen and ink, because it's such an architectural image and it's so sort of controlled. It's really going to be something I want to draw in the pens sort of on top of the landscape. So I'm going to initially paint as if this isn't here and get this sort of very soft landscape in, and then I'm going to draw this in pen afterwards. And then this, you can see straight away, is crying out to be white ink, isn't it? There's going to be a lot of white ink across a background. So again, I'm going to, when I initially paint this, we're going to leave this to being quite a small amount of white, and I'm going to introduce more white with the pen work afterwards. So I'm going to keep the water initially. I want to just get this horizon line in first of all. So I'm going to start with water across my horizon here, just to establish that sort of line. So you want a square brush, square-ended brush, one that's in proportion to the size of paper that you've managed to get for today. And I'm just going to, this is my horizon, so it's not going to come above the bottom third. I just want to get that line in nice and invisible, complete invisible painting at this point, I know, which is slightly strange, but I'm just going to wet the bottom half of my page. I've masking taped my paper down, which I would recommend, because we're going to want to use some washes here, so we need to get the paper, we need to sort of slightly control our paper so it's not getting too carried away. The horizon is actually slightly at an angle, so it's slightly higher on one side than the other, but if it comes out straight, it doesn't matter. So colour-wise, I'm going to be looking for a grey-blue to begin with. There's quite a lot of warmth in this side of the painting, but I'm going to start with quite a pale, but a sort of grey-blue tone coming through. So to get that, I'm going to use grey and a little, blue and a little bit of brown, rather than going straight into the grey, because I find that tends to give you a slightly, because there are quite a lot of warm tones in this, so I want to keep some sort of warmth there. So I'm just going to take my horizon line across, and again, we're not trying to do a complete photograph because we have a photograph, so we're sort of like, I want to give the impression of what we've got going on here. So I'm just starting, I'm leaving this side a little bit because I want to, this has got land and it's got lots of light on it, so I want to get my paint in to start to define where I'm going. This is just a base coat, so it can be almost any colour, just because I've got to start somewhere, and I've got to draw attention into where I want to paint. The paint gets much darker down here, but I'm still going to just wash that in that first sort of layer of colour, just so that I can see where I'm working from. And then I'm going to go in with a darker, so I want to get a sort of, you're looking for your kind of the colder blues. I know blue is always a cold colour, but there are blues that have a lot of purple in them and are warmer. So we're looking for those much cooler Prussian blue at the moment sort of colours, and to come in and get this sort of area here darker towards the forefront. The foreground is much darker on this sort of side here. This side of the painting is almost kind of brownish in tone. It's much warmer, it's much yellower. So I'm going to try and get some of these really cool, I imagine the sea is much, you can sort of feel the temperature change as you come across the image, can't you? This side here is really sort of cold. Not that I imagine any of it's particularly warm, but you know, it's got much coldness sort of in here. And then the landscape is almost the same colour at the top. So I'm going to get, using this blue, now that I've just sort of like established where this blue is sort of going, I'm going to mix up a little more, and I'm going to use the same colour for that headland or the sort of mountains. I'm not trying to copy them exactly, but I just want to get a a sort of feel of mountainous shapes, so that my bottom line is first of all just straight, just to match that horizon line through there, and then quickly I'm going to come back across with the same colour, and now I think about my top edge and just slightly push or manipulate that top edge so that I can see that top edge is sort of mountain. And then I can take it here. I want to quite quickly get this very dark headland in as well on this side, so I'm starting to just by sort of getting that bank in there, and then I'm going to go in darker. I haven't got a wet paper on that side, but I think that's okay because this is quite a controlled shape, this sort of dark shape, and I'm going to put it in black and with a very little bit of umber in it, so it's not dead black, it's black and umber. Umber is such a good word, isn't it? It's one of those lovely words that you can really roll on your tongue. So this area of darkness is only going to be about, it's not even a quarter of the width across your page, it's a fifth, if that. So, but it is quite dominant despite being that, and it leads the eye into that structure, which we're going to put in later so well. So I'm just going to start by putting that in, and I'm going to brush up to kind of create that headland just into there. The edge of it, the bottom edge, is not completely straight because it's a curve. We're seeing a curve at an angle, so I just want to get that sort of bit in there, very, very dark, and then I'm going to come straight back in with some black along the top edge. I just feel like I want to get that really quite stark. I think I'm probably going to eventually be adding some pen detail to that to get that really sort of striking, because it's quite a strong, it's a nice sort of wedge shape coming across that leads the eye across to this structure that's we're going to do here, and just sort of like map that in there. And then when you get to this edge, this bottom hill just picks up a little bit on that darkness, so while it's still damp I'm just going to put some pigment on there, and then I'm going to use my brush to bleed it upwards and sort of fade it in so it's not too stark on this side, just to sort of bring a little bit of that darkness across behind both of the images there. Now, of course, I've got a second row of mountains kind of coming up here, and if you notice, the sky at the bottom has this slightly yellow tone to it, so to get that in almost without having to paint with yellow, the blue that I'm going to use across here, and I now want to go for one of those more purpley blues, just a slightly warmer blue, so that it's got, and then what I'm doing is I'm sort of contrasting to the yellow sky, because yellow is the opposite colour, or the complementary colour. I'm going to just make sure that the blue that I use is slightly warmer in tone, and I'm ignoring, pretending this temple or whatever it is that isn't existing. So I'm just going to bring a line, just roughly estimating what that mountain shape is like. It sort of comes up a bit here and a bit sort of around there. And then I'm actually going to take that colour all the way down over the top, because I've got an underlayer that I've already painted, and that will sort of slightly poke through, slightly change the tone that I've got, so that I can still see that there's some differentiation between those sort of two mountain areas. So that's, I almost don't want to touch this again. I might come back and fiddle with it, you know what it's like. At the moment, I'm almost quite happy with that just existing as it is, because it's so wet and sort of alive, and I quite like that. Sky-wise, there's a definite darkness above here, and then the yellowness kind of comes across the page here. So I'm going to now put some water across here and get some tone in the sort of top right-hand corner of this. I'm going to keep I'm reluctant to go this way yet, because this is where the sort of the light source is going to be. So I'm just going to put in some water first of all into this top corner. Just so at the moment it's like, again, more invisible painting, but then I'm going to use that bluey colour, the same sort of colour that I've got here, but I'm going to put a tiny bit more of that more cold Prussian blue and umber into it, and I just want to get this corner. I want lots of water in that. I want that to really sort of spread and to move, because sky, it's really hard to see colour divisions in the sky because it's such a smooth surface. I mean, it's not really smooth surface, it's sort of gas and stuff, isn't it? So, but it doesn't look, you don't want it to look like it's some skies have real sort of edges and banks of cloud. This is just this sort of real misty sort of quality, so that's quite hard to achieve. So I'm just going to try doing it by keeping it really kind of light and wet. Where I've got that line that's appeared on the sort of middle, I'm going to go back and just use some water and just see if I can get that to flick out, just sort of get it to disappear off into the sort of white side. I don't want there to be a hard line there. And I'm going to get the colour more punchy up into this corner here. I want there to be more darkness sort of blending in up here, keeping it quite white, quite sort of wet. And, you know, do I mind those drips? Do I mind those drips? I'm just going to soften them this time. I know I love my drips, but I'm just going to sort of work them back so they're still quite light. And just this sort of like, you know, patchy sort of cloud on one side. And it's this, I love this, I'm just dotting through, I love this sort of edge through here that you only really get with watercolour, and you can't control that. I can't tell you how that happened, but it has happened, and it just gives that sort of moment where the land meets the water, real sort of crispness, and you know, a really exciting moment there. And then I can now see that on the other side, this corner up here, where you've got a tiny bit of shadow off my light, if I just put that on, that might help. There we are.
Do you ever use tissue paper?
Yes, sometimes I do, particularly if you've got clouds and you want to get real cloud banks in. You can use tissue to sort of suck the paint out again and sort of give this really nice sort of, you know, so you put on a sky colour and then pull it off again to kind of get these very soft clouds. And another one, have you ever tried using salt? Yeah, if you get rock salt, and you obviously have to do this not when you're working vertically, but you get rock salt and you drop it onto wet watercolour, it sucks the watercolour out in a kind of granular pattern. So if you're doing things like a beach, you can do a big sweep of sort of really wet yellow, and then you can drop your rock salt on, and it sucks all the, and you start getting layers of like texture through that way, which is really, you know, sometimes it's very unpredictable, but that's kind of why I like it. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I'm just getting a little bit more of my bluey umber colour into this corner, because you've got this sort of, you can see how this is where the patch of light is starting to come. You've got some shine here. When that goes, you'll see how this is now becoming our sort of point of sunlight here. And I want to kind of get a slightly yellow colour mixed up now, just to start bringing in across the sort of horizon line and down here, because it's reflecting down here quite a sort of yellowy tone. But obviously it's not going to be buttercup yellow. It's not that sort of yellow. It's we're looking for, I would say, an ochre with a tiny, tiny little bit of grey into it. I would sometimes use blue, but sometimes that risk with that is that it's going to go greenish. So I think if I use a little bit of grey, that should give me this sort of dirty, it's an attractive dirty yellow, but it is quite a lovely colour. It's going to have a greenish hue, but hopefully not overly green. So I'm going to then come in and get that just along the sort of hillside there. Now at the moment it's a stripe. I'm going to change that by adding a lot of water to it and softening it back up. So it's not going to remain a stripe, I hope, because I don't want that sort of like a big sausage across the horizon line. So I then want to come back and pull the water up the page. And if it comes down and collects again that horizon line, I don't mind that at all. That's sort of quite acceptable. That's going to add some sort of detail, but I'm going to really almost scrub at it and pull that up with water so that that line starts to disappear. I don't want to have this sort of like, you know, horizon snake happening. Not this time round. I've got a house full of snakes at the moment. It's a bit bizarre, but I've got a lodger and he's got 6 snakes. And while I'm doing this, they're in the bathroom having a bath. He's not in the bath with the snakes, but the snakes are all having to have their weekly bath. So at the moment, my bath is full of boa constrictors. Right, so this is probably why I've got snakes on the brain. So, okay, it's quite good, isn't it? Yeah. I imagine them all wearing little sort of, you know, frilly bath hats with sort of like bubble bath, but I don't think it's quite like that. So now I've got this sort of yellow colour on my palette. I want to get some of it into the sea here, and I'm not going to worry too much about this light trail at the moment. I'm going to get just flicking in some of this yellow tone down here, because remember, we always work with the big areas first. We try and cut out the detail first of all, and then work, and we come back to the detail later. Detail is, we can come back and we can work it and we can sort of play with it and push it in afterwards. So I'm just going to sort of blend in some of that yellow through there to get that colour. And I think I'm going to go back, and I think I'm going to punch this up a bit and get even more. So I'm going to go back with a kind of pure ochre, kind of wet it and just get some. So this area here is really quite yellowish. So I'm going to build up some ochre into the sea here because I want this contrast. This side has got to be warmer. This side is going to be much cooler because you've got this sort of misty sunset coming through. This sort of last sun poking through this sort of very misty, kind of almost opaque sky. So I'm just adding extra ochre into here. I'm still leaving an area of white. I don't know if that's coming across so well on the camera. If I just turn that light away, I'm just going to pull the curtain. Just is that too dark now? Well, hopefully you can see a bit better that you've got. We've still got some white paper showing here, which is going to be the basis of my highlight. But I want to keep. I'm just flicking some yellow through here. This bottom corner is really dark. This bottom edge is really dark. So I will be adding, probably going to do that quite soon, some much darker tones into that, which I can then work over later with the white pen. But that's starting to get my very sort of basic landscape areas kind of pulled out. There's definitely got to be a lot more darkness happening here. This is too light, and there needs to be a little bit more darkness along here. I might lose that edge, which I like, so that's a shame. I might not do that straight away. I'll creep up on that. So, but I want to get this area down here darker now. So I'm going to go back in. So really, I'm seeing this as a kind of Prussian blue again. Oh, those Prussians, but quite dark. Maybe even putting some black and umber into it. And so I've got Prussian blue, I've got umber, and I've got black in, and I want to get some darkness and keep it quite sort of, I'm dotting it in. If it gets too dotty, I might go back and wet it down and sort of pull it down. But there's obviously the big area of shadow here because this is where this temple or structure is creating this area of shadow reflectiveness here. So we'll later on, we're going to come back to that, and it'll make more sense once we've got the structure drawn in. And then I want to take this corner here dark as well. So I just want a little area of this dark tone coming into this corner, just to sort of pull that through, so that I'm starting to get a sort of this relationship is sort of joining through. Still a bit blobby on this side, a bit sort of bitty. So again, I am going to soften it again, take it through with some water, just to sort of soften that out a bit. But I'm quite liking it. There's a bit of texture here because the water does have a texture to it. And I'm going to use a little bit. I'm not going to mix up a lot more of this, but I've got sort of like, when you get that bit of paint on your brush and it's still a bit dry, but there's still some pigment there. And I'm going to use that to draw this sort of, because there's like a sort of a bank in the sea, isn't there? Like a sort of real strong stripe through the top half of that picture, kind of coming through like that there. And then I'm going to just let that fade off behind again, as if that building isn't there at all. And then I can soften that down and then go around perhaps with some more darkness into this area. It's quite dramatic, the colour that we've got here. It's really quite strong and dark. So let's mix up some, again, some sort of blackness, and let's let the watercolour do its thing and have a real good dribble and pour through there. So it's quite, let it do some marks for us so that it's giving us some real painterly kind of moments through there. And then just sort of drag that, bring that back. You can always turn, I love square brushes, you can flip it round so that you've got a very thin line, and then you can pull some of these paints across this very sort of thin edge of your brush and work those sort of backwards and forwards. And if you think you're getting too much of a stripiness, if you don't like it, you can then go back over with water and soften it down. But I'm going to leave a bit of texture like that. I think that works quite well. Let me just bring my curtain a bit across and get the shadow. Right, okay, so I'm now going to have a quick look at this area over here. I want to get this darker because now this is becoming darker. This now doesn't look dark enough. So I'm going to go in with some black paint. Really just the sort of pure black watercolour. If I can't get it dark enough with that, I'm going to go back in later with ink. But again, so let's take this up. It's sort of dried a bit now, so I've got a bit more control over my paint. And I'm working up in sort of vertical slices. And then I can come along and just slightly create that indication of forest, and maybe a little building on there, but just that sort of edge coming like that. And then sweep that darkness up to meet it, and there's a nice dark shadow on the water there which I can flick in and pull that up, and that's getting that a bit darker. And just by doing those sort of different layers of paint like that, I'm getting some sort of depth and things happening in that sort of section. Now I'm starting to feel like I need to think about my temple. I need to get that in. I think I'm going to get it in. I'm going to put a little bit more darkness along this horizon line. So let me see. I'm gonna go for. I've got some black sort of live on my palette, but I'm going to soften it with some blue, and just. Oh, see, I'm hesitating. And look at me. I'm sort of like going. Should I go for it? I'm going to go for it. I'm going to just bring that. Oh, it's not as bad. I thought it was going to be really, really dark. It's not as dark as I feared. So I'm going to bring that along there to sort of get some more shadow into that line, and just build a little bit up that, and that's the top horizon line where I've got those mountains. I want to get some more contrast into that now, so I'm going to follow the line that's there with my brush and bring that across just to get my mountain a bit more standing out a bit more against that yellow. And again, I don't want the big stripy sort of snake effect, so once I've got that in, come back with some water and pull that edge across so that it's not being too stripy. It's not going to look like it's got, like, you know, like I said, a big sort of toothpaste line across it. Yeah, okay, so that's sort of got those a bit darker, and hopefully we're still seeing a little bit of yellow happening in the sky here. I think I want a bit more darkness in the sky up here, so let's turn the volume up a bit, or turn it down or whatever on here, so where it's quite dark, and then again lots of water to kind of blend that off so that it's not too stripy. It's going to be a little bit, but just to sort of soften those two together. And I'm going to just go grab a dry brush and fuzz those edges in, and if you've got a dry brush you can kind of work it over the surface, and it just helps to sort of stop there being too hard a kind of line there. Right, okay, so this is sort of very much my background. I'm kind of at the moment happy with all the tonal things going on. I think I'm going to have to make some of them more dramatic, but what's quite handy about this is now I've got these mountains in place, I can now look at the temple shape and I can think about putting that in. Now, you could go straight in and draw it in pen and be quite accurate with it, but I'm actually going to use a smaller square brush and some dark paint to kind of map it in and see if I'm happy in its position, but I don't want it to be solid, set in stone. And then I'm going to come in with the pen and kind of tidy up what I've done, because the way we do this is I like to see these kind of construction marks. So if I go back to look at my original picture, I can see that this sort of big top section that's like a sort of almost like a boat shape is completely above the mountain line. So I know that's got to sit in this area here. This main sort of trunk goes through part of the background, so into the sea, and it stops about level with this area here. So I'm going to start off by getting you've got the two big uprights, and I've got a left and a right upright. So I'm going to start with the two big uprights, but I'm not really painting them. I'm just going to mark in roughly where they're going to go. So I'm seeing that big one just as a thin line to begin with. It's going to get a lot fatter to about sort of there, and then I'm thinking, right, so this angle of my boat sort of top end is going to come across like that in a kind of sweep. And this second one is going to come in roughly sort of around there. Now, at the moment, it's just a weird kind of ghosty shape floating above everything else, but we're going to make it more solid. So we're going to get all the details going to come later with pen. So I'm just blocking in the really big basic shapes of the structure. So I've got those two sort of doing that. This is going to come a little bit longer. I'm going to swing that out. Bless you. It's all right. And then I'm going to put my second sort of cross piece going like that. It probably should be a little bit higher, but you know, it's my picture, so I'll cry if I want to, kind of thing. But you know, it's like, as I always say, we're just trying to get this impression of this sort of all fitting in. Now I've got then there's four short cross pieces, so I know I've got to get two into this middle section. So I'm going to sort of say, right, I'm going to need to have one there roughly, and one there, and one here, and one there. Now I think in the original picture, these actually should all come up a bit and be a bit taller. But if you haven't done it like that, well, we're not going to do it like that. We're going to do it like this so it fits into our picture. It's fine. I said it's not trying to be a photographic representation of what we're doing in front of us. It's trying to get the impression of this sort of incredible structure in this landscape. So I'm then going to take the sort of horizontal piece in onto each of those, and I am going to bring this up. So I think this top needs to come up higher. So I'm just going to paint it in again a little bit higher, and we'll sort it out later, you'll see. So that gives me a bit more room then, kind of going upwards, and that cross piece can come up a bit. And there's a dark piece in the middle there that sort of fits in like that. And I've got another cross piece on these coming through. And then, so at the moment that's really quite sort of ghosty and it's quite insubstantial, and that's okay because we're going to sort of start working with it now. And I'm going to start thinking about this shadow. One of the things that's going to really locate this is getting some reflection into the water kind of coming down after it, coming down off these great big shapes, because that's really going to root it in the in reality. It's because it's starting to impact, the shadow is where it's starting to impact on its environment, so it's changing the surface of the water and creating that sense of solidity by giving it this root of shadow. So I'm going to put that in first of all, because it's almost as important to kind of get that feeling to kind of anchoring in your shape as it is getting the actual shape in. So it's going to start coming down across here, and just has someone got a bit of music coming on in the background? Would they mind just if it's you, would you mind just muting your mic a little bit, because we've got, thank you, it's got someone's popped the radio on, which is lovely, but you know, it's distracting. And then I can make these grow up a little bit taller. They've almost got like, they look like sort of mitre boards on the top, haven't they? Sort of like professors' hats. It looks like, I'm sure that isn't what it is because it's a different culture, but that's what they make me think of, those sort of mortarboards, that's the word. And then I can bring that up, stretch that up a bit higher, blacken this in, and let's slightly exaggerate the size of that top bit so it's quite sort of lowering, and it starts to look almost like a face after a while, with kind of like great thick eyebrows. Just gives it quite a lot of personality. And then you've got sort of top sections there, and then let's darken again. Let's bring that water down a bit darker. So all the layers overlapping, and I think mine is going at a slightly different angle to the picture, but I think all the layers of paint start to give it a kind of sort of sense of depth. At the moment it still looks like it's made of glass kind of floating over the surface, but we're going to work on that. So I just want to make sure there's that little patch of light between those two uprights here. I think that's quite important to get in to continue that because it shows that there's that space between them. And I want to make sure with my shadow, so I'm just going to keep bringing that down into that sort of water. And using this side-by-side motion of the brush gives that watery feel. It just gives you that surface ripple. And we've got a sort of stretch of shadow coming out from there, and I can sort of bring that through and bring some of these darker tones, start just dabbing it into that bright. Let me get a bit more dark on my brush. Where you've got this sort of coming across into this bright water here, I can just start flicking some of that darkness into that bright, so it's starting to give the shadow into that sort of that section of highlight, because it's got, where you have this very bright shine on the water, it's more about it gives you the contrast of the shadow of the ripples, and then you've got the white kind of coming in around them. So I'm just dotting some of the darkness into that sort of area, so it's starting to give that ripple kind of quality. This area still feels like it needs to get darker, but I think we'll come back and do a wash over that. What I'm going to do now is switch to my brush pen to get a bit more solidity into this area here. If you haven't got a brush pen, then use a drawing pen you've got that's quite chunky, or any sort of marker pen or something that you're happy drawing with. You might even want to use a fine brush and some ink or some very intense paint if that's more your sort of bag. But I want to now define this sort of shape up here a bit. So I'm just sketching in on top of, and the good thing about this brush pen is that it works really well on top of a slightly wet surface. It's not worried by that. So I want to get some more power into this structure now and make it darker. And I'm not worrying too much about how accurate it is. I'm just sort of seeing the sort of paint that I've got there. It's more about making the paint lines that you've committed to, about deciding that that's the structure of your temple, rather than saying like this is exactly what the camera sees in front of it. So I want to kind of get that feel of the structure, but I am also looking at the paint marks that I've got and picking out which ones of those work best on the piece, rather than trying to be completely representational. So I want to sort of get those flat hats with the flats. So almost the hats, the hats on top of the posts, I'm trying to say, because we've got this flat square. If you just think of it as being like an arrow, very flat arrow, kind of like coming up and down like that, and that's actually just gives you all you need to know that that's a flat sort of tile or little hat on top of my posts. And you know, we're trying to get this stark contrast between this very black silhouetted structure against this very soft environment of misty sort of light on the sea. And so this is why we're now going in and doing these sort of strong lines. Just make sure that your lines kind of are true to themselves. So like here, I've got to bring this one across, and then I've got to make sure it's appearing on this side at the same level, so that it's not wonky. As long as it's true in your own world, that's all you need to kind of achieve. So again, just bring that across and take that across. And if you've got one that's come across a bit higher than the other, just go back and make the first one higher, so bring it up to meet it really. And then I'm coming down, I've got this sort of gate section coming through here, and this starts to immediately gives more punch to this light behind it, because you're making this darker. The sea now behind this shape is starting to get a feeling of more sort of luminescence, because you've got a bigger contrast between your surfaces. So it's always that thing, if you can't make something lighter, make the stuff around it darker, and then you get the contrast that you get with light. So eventually we're going to get really dark with this temple shape. So we want these sort of lovely squares of bright kind of coming through from the background. And so this becomes almost like a stamp on the landscape, a sort of almost like a piece of calligraphy, isn't it, in a strange kind of way. It's got that feeling of that it's already been written in pen on the world. So I'm just going to keep my shapes, just seeing what my shapes are doing, and allowing all these sort of squares to appear through. And you'll notice that they're not all even sized, because we're looking at this at a slight angle. if you're thinking, oh no, my rectangles aren't all the same width, well, that's because they're not the same width, so don't worry about it. Just be true to the shapes that you've got on the paper, because, you know, people are not going to be holding the photograph up and comparing them, so it doesn't matter if it's not exactly the shape that the photograph's given you in this case, because we're not trying to get, so we always have a photograph, and when you finish doing this, you can always put the photograph in the bin, and nobody, all the recycling, and nobody never needs to know what you're copying, and they'll just go, wow, that's amazing. And then I'm going to just want to get this top section in, so I've got these strong sort of shapes up here, either side of this sort of almost like nose section, and then I'm just looking at the shapes of my paint and just picking those out to be the top edge, kind of coming through and making that quite sort of dramatic statement. And then there's a little sort of, I don't know what's going on here, there's a little sort of like line of, with a hole through it, kind of coming through just up there. And I now want to get this much darker, but I'm also going to think about the shadow that's happening underneath here, because now I've got this nice brush pen, I can reflect some of that, the shapes coming down underneath, just by, you can see how you start to see there's a line, disappears, breaks up quite quickly, but just below each of these pillars there's this sort of little reflection of very dark shadow, and that just really helps to show you that the surfaces change between the environment. So we go from the air environment, where you've got this obviously very strong structure, and then this kind of water where the shadow is immediately breaking up and moving across the surface, so it's literally reflecting the surface that it's on. Now I want to get this pagoda, that's the word I've been sort of reaching for, I think, pagoda, I want to get this darker. So we could come through with the pen and sort of shade it in with some marks, but I think I'm probably going to either go for some ink and a brush and kind of put that all in darker, or if you don't have inks, just come back with your watercolour or gouache or something that's a bit more, and use your watercolour quite opaquely, so that it's going to get this, I want this to be quite black now, so I want quite a solid colour on here, so I'm going to use some black ink that I've got in a pot, in my little ink pot, and a smallish square brush to come in, and I want to get this to be really sort of stark and standing out against this environment. So now I've got my outline to work to, I'm almost just filling it in, because it's going to be like a flat silhouette kind of coming through. I want it to stand out really stark against this sort of misty sky. And that should hopefully start to really get it to punch out against this sky that we've created, and it'll add a whole lot of brightness. It'll make the sky and the mountains behind sort of have more of a glow, is what we're hoping. So I'm just initially putting in the structure. And you can see how actually if there was reflective light on here, I could leave that sort of area of light, and it actually gives it quite a 3D quality, but eventually I'm going to get rid of all of those and make it really strong and dark and bold against this sort of background. And again, if you've got a bit here, this is quite good, because if you think you've got a bit that hasn't quite worked, you know, you can see how you can alter it. The black ink will come in and let you add some more detail or change the shape in a way that you find more pleasing. And you can see how, although I've got the remnants of where I sort of didn't leave enough room for this bit up showing through, it doesn't really matter. No one's upset about it. It just becomes part of the painterly surface, which is kind of what we're looking for. And that's now, see how lovely and stark that's looking against the backdrop. That's really kind of standing out in like the monolith that it is, you know. I do wonder how on earth, you know, they must have built this, because unless this is a tidal zone, somehow this would have to have been constructed sort of part underwater. And I'm assuming that it's not something that's built in the last sort of 100 years or so, because it looks so ancient. I mean, I could be completely wrong about that, but it would be quite amazing to think of the engineering that has gone into making this. And, you know, how do they attach it to the bed of this river or sea? You know, it must have been quite an incredible thing to see. I think sometimes I always think that things about the sort of medieval cathedrals and things like and buildings like that. Somewhere like Ely Cathedral, which is so, it looks so amazing now, but then if you try and imagine it in a landscape with no skyscrapers and no coloured lights and no electricity, and how utterly amazing that building must have seemed, these sort of buildings must have seemed when you're comparing them to the world when they were built. It's almost impossible to imagine the impact and the power that these constructions must have had, and how, you know, how incredible that amount of work that goes into them is. And I think the way this sort of desire to kind of place these sort of great things against the landscape is so sort of a universal. All right, so that's really starting to stand out beautifully dark against this background. And just by getting that in with my ink and brush has really sort of made it much more defined, and it's sort of given this incredible sort of focal piece. So I'm quite enjoying that strong thing against here. I can see how now straight away I want to get this area darker, and I want to get some more shadow so into this sort of thing. So this is where I'm now going to use my ink over my watercolours. If you've not got just ordinary like quink ink will work really well on this sort of thing. If you haven't got any, again, just go back in with quite a thick and not too watery watercolour. You know, watercolour that's more pigment than it is water. And I'm just sort of gently doing this backwards and forwards, flicking across the surface to kind of really build up this area of shadow so that it becomes really contrasting. When you actually look at the bottom edge of the picture, it's almost like along this bottom edge here, it's almost black. There's almost like no lightness at all. So I really want to darken up under here to show how it's got this impact on the horizon, sorry, not on the horizon, on the landscape, that it's so sort of strong and part of it. And you often find, luckily, with a lot of these dark inks, these black inks, they're got a brown base, and this one has, because it's actually a charcoal black, which has a slightly warmer, it's not a blue back, and that's quite useful because it just adds that very subtle hint of warmth in the shadows as opposed to blue. It's not essential, but it's just quite nice that it's like that. And I'm just working across that surface, thinking about where those legs disappear into the water. And you can see now, as the more you look at it, you think, gosh, yes, that shadow really is dark. It's almost as dark as the actual wood of the structure. But I just want to keep that hint of the separate legs, trunks, kind of coming through, just so that there's there, that I can get that sense of the building kind of going into the water. So it makes me want to get this whole bottom edge of the picture a lot darker again, but I don't want to get too heavy-handed with it straight away, because you can always, although we've always got things that can pull it back, I don't want to get too dark, but I just want to take a wet brush and then pull some of this ink area across here. So I'm just going to start by using wet, just if there's any ink on the surface, and if it's not going to come across, it's not going to play ball, I'm going to use my ink and a little bit of Prussian blue watercolour. So I want to get a slightly more blue tone into that area, so I'm just going to use, I've got some black, a tiny bit of black ink on my palette, and now I'm going to come in with some blue watercolour to add to it, and some water. And if you've got blue ink, you could have an experiment with that. And I just want to get that slightly bluer tone and draw that across out of this side. So that's going to come across. And there's still that line up here, so I can kind of know that I can work sort of into this area up towards this line. And then just darken up this area, so we're still getting, and as we're getting this area darker, conversely this side will start to look lighter. and then you get more intensity and brightness into that sun. So it is like this real sort of balancing act as you bring this down darker. And again, I'm going to go for another round of black and a little bit of ink and a bit of Prussian blue. And bring that darkness into this corner more. So what we're after is trying to get that real light feel on the far side. There's a little bit more light on this side of the, whereas it's coming up because it's sort of getting it cast on. I don't want to destroy that. I want to keep that at the moment because I'm quite liking that sort of extra power of light behind it. This area up here, although it's not as dark, I think it still needs to get a bit more dark because it's quite a white sort of path behind there. So I'm going to wet the brush I've been using and half wash it so that when I come across I've got quite a light cast of paint on it, and then if I come back with a bit more on top I can build up to it gradually. I'm not going too dark too quickly, but I want to just take that a bit down through there because I'm trying to keep this area as my real highlight. So maybe I think I'm going to go back to that ochre colour at this point and just do some ochre wash across that line. And because you've got this really dark inky structure, what's great is that nothing's going to shift that. That's sort of, you know, solid. So I can take my washes across its structure, just paint right across it, and it's not going to smudge this area, but it will let the paint colour be the same across all the areas of paper, and that gives it that kind of you know, it takes the eye across the whole of that sort of piece. But I'm starting to get now more of a sense of the darkness and this sort of standing out and this light coming from this sort of way. So I'm happier about that balance now. I think it really needed to get quite dark down here. I'm going to get some blue. I want to get some more Prussian blue into this dark area. So I'm just going to put the lid back on my ink. As we know, history has taught us that it's very important to keep the lids on your inks as much as possible. Otherwise it can all go wrong. So I'm now going to go for just a wash of blue. So I want to find my Prussian blue, and I want to get a slightly more blue tone into this area here, so it's not quite just monochrome, and can just work that through into the shadow and soften that into that sort of area there. And I think I'm going to get some of that colour as well because I'm quite liking that. I want to bring up some more on this sort of mountain area here and just pull that across there. So I'm getting some more of that tone here. I think this sort of pathway at the back is too light, so I now need to bring that up over the top and start to knock that back because it's too bright there. I want it to be, it's only really a couple of tones different to this, particularly the time you get to this edge. So let's get that a bit darker, but sort of bringing that through. And then hopefully that's got this sort of thing. Does that mountain line, now I'm saying that, I'm thinking, does this mountain edge here, is that too soft? I think it is too soft. So I think I'm going to use a bluey black again, and I want to now make this mountain edge a bit more stark. I feel it's disappearing a bit. And it is, you know, it's a mountain, it's quite a big thing in the picture, you know. So I'm going to soften that. I don't want the stripe, but I'm going to just sort of get that in, and then I can wet that and get some darkness. And what's nice is because when you get those drips, they're going to follow the horizon line, I hope. So I'm going to let them, that one's immediately not followed the horizon line. Ah, well, we'll get you later. Teach me. We can always flick those away and soften them up if we want to. And I just want to get that line stronger through there. I quite like that shape that's appearing there, so I might just erase that one a little bit. But I might leave that because, you know, we're doing watercolour and watercolour's cool. And this top edge now, again, I'm going to use my dry brush and just blend that line in a little bit. And then I'm going to go for a really small brush and just follow that top edge of the mountain. So let me just get my little tiny brush and come forward, little tiny brush. Your time is now, or relatively small brush. Here we go. I think this one. And I'm going to darken up that top edge again of the mountain, so I'm getting a real stark feel of it against the sky. So I'm going to bring that edge just a bit darker, just by using a tiny brush, just against the sky. So that then that sky becomes more luminescent in feel. And I seem to have, the headland, the sort of, there's like, you can see there's a couple of different areas of land in this sort of section. And I've sort of like, I've lost the definition of that a bit up here. So I'm going to just work, it doesn't matter if it's, you know, following the picture or not. I just want to work at least a second one in and soften that down again to the horizon, just with my tiny brush, just to get a bit of differentiation into that area. I don't want to make it too stripy. I might have to bring some more tone into the sort of land above a little bit, but I just wanted to start by getting that kind of in there, and then maybe with the same sort of smallish brush, put some tone on, and then soften again, just bring little vertical paint marks coming up and bringing that into, and just leaving that tiny little bit of highlight, as it were, just, and maybe even making that even smaller, just so that it's floating above that line. So I've got that little bit of contrast, so I am seeing some sort of different areas in the surface that I've created there. A little bit of differentiation. Now I'm thinking I want to do something, a little bit of that on this side as well, but I'm also thinking I want to slightly increase the yellow ochre quality of that horizon as well. So I'm just going to go along and again just slightly pick up this edge here of my mountain, and I'm going to soften that down so it's not too, again I haven't just drawn an outline around it because that's a bit you know, a bit odd. So I'm going to take that through, and I want to make sure it goes through into that structure there as well, because then again that helps to really bring your eye and push those back at the same sort of level. But then I'm going to dab and sort of soften and work at that line so it's not too much of an outline, so that it's blending down into my surface on here. And yeah, just start to, this one I'm kind of like, I've done like my umbery black, but this I'm actually just not washing my brush properly, but just so it's almost just dirty water, so that it's pulling the colour out of the pigment out of the top line, and then sort of allowing that so you don't get too much colour differentiation. It's more about tone. So I've just used again that sort of umbery Prussian-y blue mixture that's been going around for sort of mountains and things at the moment. And then I'm almost not using pigment here. I'm just using dirty water, which isn't as romantic as it is, more romantic than it sounds really, but it just sort of helps to, and then I'm just working at that line with the water on the brush just to sort of pull it and soften it and get rid of it so that it's not too strong. So I'm not trying to add too much pigment in. Right, I think this area on the side here, I can see there needs to be some more darkness into this here. But what I'm going to do now is use my ochre in the same sort of way. So I'm going to paint like a stripe of ochre along this top edge and then soften it upwards. So because I'm using, I've got a pot of sort of very dark paint water. So I've got a second pot that I haven't used yet that's clean. And that's when it's really quite useful to have second sort of water supply, because now I can mix up some ochre with my clean water, so it's not going to be a dirty ochre colour, it's going to be quite pure. I'm going to come along the horizon line sort of going upwards the other way as it were. And I'm also going to then use some of these ochre tones into the sea over here. So let's get a bit of ochre going, and then so it's sort of like wet but with quite a lot of pigment in it, you know, not too feeble. And I'm just going to bring that along to match this sort of line, just as a sort of sweep, so the point is following the shape of the mountain top, but sort of in reverse. So we're sort of going up. I mean, you could, if I wasn't sort of like in rather cramped studio space and all the things, cord cables around me, I would probably think about turning the paper upside down, or turning my board upside down, and then working with gravity. But I think the logistics of doing that right now are going to be quite tricky. So I'm just going to hope I don't get too many obvious kind of runs, and then I can go back again. I'm sort of just, as I said, using water really, and I find I'm almost doing like a sort of round and round movement to kind of blend and soften that line and pull it up into the paper above. And just so that I don't get too much of a stripe happening, but it starts to give that mountain, that sky, a kind of luminescence. Let me just tilt up a tiny bit. You can see how it's just giving it that sort of slightly luminous feel. Has everyone else got incredibly strong winds today? I feel like I'm at sea at the moment, because I'm sort of, all my windows are shaking in their footings. So it's quite. It was. I've been building a new chicken house, and in spare time, and it's nearly finished, but there's some terrible vision in the middle of the night. I was going to wake up. I'm using my dry brush now just to sort of pull those colours up. I had this vision that I was going to come and find it all destroyed, but luckily it's all intact, so that's a good sign. It's had a good test run before the chickens get here. Right. So, and then I want to bring some more ochre colour into this light section here, because I want this to really kind of start to glow. So I'm going to use, again, the ochre paint with the clean water, or now the ochre water, and exaggerate this sort of ochre colour across here. So where it's going, and where it goes behind, I want to make sure it goes behind the areas of the temple or the pagoda structure, because then it starts to sort of link the eye through, and it starts to help put these in, literally put them into perspective. So these squares through here, I want them to have that sort of more glowing ochre colour on this side, less on this side, more on this side, because obviously we've got this sort of seat of light on this side, and we can see it working on the water, coming through. And if we slightly dab the line, so we're not just doing a stripe, it starts to give a hint of surface as well, because we're going to slightly sort of, I always think of it like a sort of, it makes a noise like a little tiny train going chugga 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 across the page. You want that little sort of dabbing noise and sort of motion, so that you're getting that broken line rather than it being too straight and stripy. I just sort of don't want it to be, we're not painting in sort of, wallpaper stripes. It should have a bit of texture to it. And I can just bring a little bit of that down into here and through there. And I want to get a fair bit of ochre into this section, because I am then going to come back in with the white pen and sort of reclaim some of the white. But this is going to start getting something to work on top of. And this right-hand corner, that's got to get darker. I've been neglecting that right-hand corner, and I can see that needs to be getting darker. But this sort of colour here is all this, it's this fantastic ochre and grey combination. It's almost, I collect colour combinations. Sometimes I get really obsessed with certain colour combinations, and I did go through a grey and gold phase, which did a lot of grey and gold based artworks. But it always reminds me of when you see those really incredible splodges of lichen on grey stone, and they're sort of like these really, when you actually look at them closely, they're these incredible sort of saffron and gold kind of explosions of colour against these very, very granite colours or backdrops, and they can look really quite startling when you isolate the colours on their own. They're quite fascinating to see how much contrast there is. I'm still thinking that the camera is slightly whiting out this area because I'm seeing more ochre on my paint than on my page than the camera is really showing you. But I'm going to now get a sort of ochre, but I'm going to put some umber into it. I want to get some dark ochre to come into this corner here. And if it's too warm, I can put some blue into it. But I'm going to start off with just the sort of umber and ochre mixture, and bring these sort of, it is quite a browny tone through here. It's dark, but it's got more warmth in it than the really sort of cold side. So I'm just really getting those, and again keeping my brush just sort of moving across the surface so that it's not flat areas at all. It's just real dabby, sort of jittering about to get that. I can see there's like a sort of band of shadow coming through, and start seeing if you can pick out the shadow lines and areas of shadow onto the of your surface. See if that can be a sort of way of getting some depth into that and bringing it across. And again, still can come dark. I mean, it can still come a bit darker. This corner seems really important to get, so that I can get this real punch of light on the surface where it's almost kind of bleeding out into, almost can't see it, it's so white up here. I'm just taking, I want that horizon to be a little tiny bit darker just in there. I don't mind that warmer colour, so I can just flick my wet brush across there just to bring some tone in through there. And then this sort of like dark area here, I'm just going to get my black ink again, or you could use your brush pen, or you could use some really intense, let me go at doing it with watercolour just in case you haven't got ink. So I'm going to use very, very intense black watercolour, and now do a little bit more onto this headland here so that it starts to echo this pagoda structure in the middle. So I want to sort of darken that down again, give it some more presence and solidity in the composition. So I'm just using the same brush, probably out of pure laziness because I had it in my hand, but also it does give me a way of just getting, instead of just doing stripes, I can put a vertical movement into the paint because this is land and because there is sort of, we're assuming forests and trees on there. That gives me a way of sort of building up layers of texture, which could be landscape, which could be, you know, because it's not water. So if I move my brush in the opposite direction, you know, it's basically thinking, right, landscape, I'm going to do landy bits, I'm going to do vertical movements, sea bits, I'm going to do horizontal brush strokes, and that will start to give you the sort of the language that you're needing for, you know, to say this is land, this is water. But just something as simple as that will just help you to differentiate between these sort of two surfaces. I can just see it's a very thin line, I don't know what it is, maybe a pier or something, but I want to take that through that shape so it's just kind of coming, again it makes sure it puts it behind what's going on. There's a couple more very sort of thin lines coming across of either darkness or structure with that sort of colour, so there, that's sort of helping. And that sort of top edge, you know, could go in and get some vertical little marks into that again to hint at buildings or foliage or something. Right, okay. And do I need some more on this horizon line? Oh, I'm still getting the feel that I could do with a little bit more darkness along that sea edge there now. You can just see how you sort of come up from air and think, oh, actually, yes, I do just want to get... there's a nice bank of paint marks here, so I'm just going to work underneath those and just, I think, darken that down a bit. Just not all the way across, just at this right-hand side. And do I want that big dribble that I've created there? I think I might just see if I can take some of the impact of it off with a bit of water. I'm not sure that it's quite, it's a bit distracting, but you know, we live with these things. These things are sent to try, and I can just sort of come in. There is a kind of like lone pole kind of standing in the water on this side, which I'm sometimes quite tempted to put little details like that in, because it sort of it helps just locate something on this side here and bring it back. So I think I might just get my brush pen and put a little tiny, you know, I need a third. I'm just pausing because you know when you think I need a third arm at this point, and I haven't got enough arms to hold everything. I'm just going to find. There we go. I'll get my pen. I'm just going to bring this sort of line just here. And although it hasn't got, I don't know what it is, but because it hasn't got a lot of shadow, I'm actually just going to give it a little tiny swirl of shadow just underneath it, just like a reflection, I suppose, isn't it, really, across the water there, just to help get that wetter. And while I've got this brush, I'm just going to come in and add a few more little shadow flicks under here. Now I'm building up towards using my white pen on some of these water reflections through here. So I'm just going to use a grubby brush again with a tiny bit of umbery brownie and just flick it over, not all of it, but just part of it, just to give it a base for the white to kind of work against. I haven't really looked at the sun up here, so I'm going to give that a minute to dry. And I think with this ochre colour, maybe just because there's kind of a round in this of sun here. I need to move this bit of paper, it's getting in the way. Decide that that's my sort of sun there, and then bring some circular sweeps kind of away from that, so that I'm getting an actual area of white in the page as a kind of sun. And then it's quite subtle, but just sort of bringing some circular radiating sort of lines out from that point, just to kind of give that so I can see where the sun is. And then I don't need to think, I think I've got quite a lot of white in the picture, but I'm just can then come in with my white paint pen and start to flick some real defined highlights onto the areas of paint, just to bring that sense of sparkle onto the water. And if I try and see some of the brush marks, if you're not sure what shape to do, try and just see some of the little brush marks of paint that you've got and kind of use those as something to work towards. So it will just, you know, if you're not sure where to go with those and just sort of go round them, go between them, slightly mimic the shape of them on top. Up here there's like really quite a strong area of white, so I'm almost just going to do some horizontal lines kind of coming backwards and forwards. You can hear the pen sort of scratching on the paper where it's just, let me come up a little bit closer if I can. There we go, and you can see how I'm taking these horizontal lines of white just through the surface, really sort of emblazoning that, imagining where the light's hitting. Just sort of like getting that real intensity on the surface now. And where you get them, you can start dotting, the lines can go into dots, just as they just, the way you can just see them just picking up those little tiny waves. And that really starts to get that sort of sequined almost effect. And I can just pick some little tiny ones up into this darker section to give that a sort of sparkle, where I've got the light coming onto these sort of areas, and on this side as well. And you can see, if you start looking at the shape of the light, they're sort of almost like little, I don't know how to describe them, scallops of sort of light on the surface, and all over this kind of, in contrast to these sort of darker tones. There's a little tiny, really bright spot of light that's just picked up on that dark landscape edge there, because it's really quite dark, quite bright, see, at the foot of this dark headland, and I think that's a really nice thing to try and bring up, is that intensity of light along that very dark bank of trees. And then looking through here at this section here, I would just put some, again, a sort of hint of light coming in between where I've got these lighter areas against this strong dark structure. I can just flick some light sort of through here. And I can, just to add a bit more of controlled, sort of get that shape coming through into the shadow. Okay, so yeah, so looking at that, I'm seeing that I'm quite liking, I like the colour palette, and I love that sort of grey and yellow that we're getting sort of through on that, and I think I'm managing to build up some lightness on this side. Just going to give my pen a bit more of a pump. I'm finding that these sort of, the pens that are designed for drawing on stones, the ones that I sell that can draw on everything, these are kind of my favourite white pens, because they are pretty good at drawing on stuff. But what I also find about them, which is quite interesting, is that they slightly absorb the paint colour of what you're working on top of a lot of the time, and that can be quite good, because then it doesn't give you a completely bright, hard, artificial highlight. It allows you to sort of pick up on some of the tone that's on it before. So you put them on and they look quite white, and they tend to slightly darken down, and then you can go back over and do more. It sort of allows you to build up in layers, rather than, it's not like just applying a can of white spray paint or something and completely blotting out the delicacy of any tone that you've got going underneath. And they're dead cheap as well, which is great, also in their favour, frankly. And again, as we come down, the pattern of the highlights, or the reflections, become bigger as we come to the front of the picture, because it's closer to us, and so they have more, you can see more of their detail. So again, think about that, so that if the ones at the front need to be sort of bigger and more kind of expressive, and the ones at the back up here become just lines and dots, really, because they're further away like that. And I can just bring a little bit of highlight across that, above that dark area again, because again it just makes that shadow look stronger and more forceful. And I can just bring some dots up into this bit here as it just moves towards, through that yellow area. And there we go. And I think I'm pretty much happy with this one. I find that landscapes, it can be raised to overwork a landscape, and I don't want to do too much more on that, because it's not about detail, it's about these big areas of light and shadow. But I think by looking at it in this way, we've got this sort of sweep of the balance between this really highlighted side, which is reflecting the sun from up above, to this much darker, sort of reflecting with this sort of incredible structure in the middle. So I'm quite happy with the way that's sort of balanced. I think I've got a few areas of background just showing through on some of this structure, which I might just go around and make a bit more definite, because I want the shape to be quite strong and stark. I don't want it to have a translucent quality suddenly. So I need to just make sure that all these edges are where I want them to be and look like they're all part of one thing. So they've got little holes up here. The only bit where there is those holes is here, so I need to make that look like that's what I want it to do. So I just need to make sure that that's happening. And there's quite a sort of nice pointy shape here, so I can just slightly edit that shape now. It's almost like a sort of dog's head that I can see sort of inside. Again, I want this to be like a real cut-out silhouette. I've kind of added an extra level there, but that's going to stay now because I'm not taking it out. And there's kind of like a little line there. I don't know what it is, obviously, but just like some sort of part of the structure. So if I can see a little detail like that, I might just want to exaggerate it just so that it's definitely there and part of the composition. And they've got a slight fat quality. They're not just square edge, they slightly flare out. So I just want to make sure that they're slightly softer. They're not too straight. They're obviously carved from wood, so they're not like they're sort of massive tree trunks. So they're not sort of machine finished in the same way as they might be, you know, if they're more contemporary. So I'm just making sure that I'm happy with the edge of this structure and where it's sitting. And then I think I'm not going to do a lot more on this. I think it's sort of where I want it to be. I might do another version, but I think I'm quite happy that this one has done what I want it to do. And it's got a nice sense of light and shade in it. So I think I'm going to stop that there. And I've managed